rewire leadership behavior. She's here to share insights on how to create measurable cultural shifts rather than short-term fixes. Please welcome Yvette Durazo. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, I think everybody's had a conflict, whether it be at home, at work, or it might be your country in conflict with another one. We see a lot of conflicts in the Middle East, and some of these conflicts come to a close, and some of them just tend to go forever. And I think for all of us who are even just bystanders, one thing that we wish for is for it to come to an end. Close that door, move on. But these people in power, obviously they don't know how to handle conflict. They don't have that conflict IQ. So let's try to, hopefully they listen today and they can take some good insights away. How did you come up with the conflict IQ framework? What were some of those early experiences for you where you decided, I've got to end these conflicts?
Well, it is a combination of various things. You know, I was brought up by a father who was an entrepreneur with no education whatsoever, and me having gone through the route of getting an education and working with people that were highly educated. That was a very different experience. And I said, how can we build more of those leaders that are like my father, that were, my father was an individual that really took very good care of his employees. And and he left a legacy. His employees really remember him because he was, a very unique person when it comes to working with them. And they had never in their life experienced somebody like that will really take care of their employees, like if they were family, right? They were, the best asset in the organization. So working for universities and working for very highly educated people and seeing that they didn't have whatever skills needed in order to treat people well, that's what took me into doing a lot of research and studying a degree in negotiation, conflict resolution, and peace building, because I thought it is not necessarily the hard skills that you gain in an educational system that makes a difference in human beings. It is, those essential people skills, the ones that make a big difference. And that is how I started looking into skills and abilities, and to be able to resolve conflicts, you have to have a lot of skills within yourself, right? What I call meta skills. And you also have to have the ability to have work within internally within yourself in order to be able to help others resolve conflict. Um, the study of my master's degree with other certifications like neuro-linguistic programming, coaching, neuroscience really got me to a level of developing something very unique. And I realized when I was working with people back in 2015 that I was into something, that I was developing something very unique. Because usually you tend to have the coaches that study coaching, and they can help you define and figure it out, inner conflict, but then don't necessarily know how to help an individual to deal with external conflict, right? And I had both sides of that, and on top of that, other certifications, and all of that combination is when I really identified that I had something very unique to bring into the business community. And I also study the spirituality of how about to resolve conflict. I went and studied a little bit of the philosophy of the Buddhist, of theology and philosophy. And one of the things that caught my attention was the idea of, in the experience that I had with people when I was helping them to resolve conflict, the fluctuation in between the levels of consciousness. And there's several levels of consciousness, and in the lowest levels of consciousness is the idea, the deep rooted idea of them against you. And then the other levels of consciousness is when you start awakening yourself and realize that it is not such a bad world, right? There are people out there that are willing to work with you well, and you start developing those levels of consciousness. Not all the time people sustain the same level of consciousness all the time, and we fluctuate from time to time. Depends on our energy, or depends on what has happened to us, and whether we have processed the things that have happened to us, right? But having experience and seeing that on people that they never expected, by doing a mediation or having a neutral person like me coming in and helping resolve conflict, and experiencing their aha moments, it really gave me the idea that this is something that I can bring into more bigger audiences, and teach leaders how to become conflict resolvers, right? And then I remember about the quote of Albert Einstein that says, you cannot resolve a level of conflict from the level of thinking that it was created, right? Or from the level of consciousness that it was created. And that caught a lot my attention, and that is how I came out with conflict intelligence quotient, the conflict IQ.
Fascinating. You mentioned a moment ago an inner conflict. What's an example of an inner conflict? Because for me, sometimes I look in the mirror and I think to myself, I need to go to the gym. I need to work out. I need to do some more exercise. But there's another part of me that says, Daniel, just eat the chocolate. Go to the fridge, eat the chocolate. And I feel like I've got a little angel on one shoulder telling me to go to the gym, and the devil on the other shoulder saying, it's okay, don't worry about the gym today. Just eat the chocolate. That's how I experience inner conflicts.
We double with
What are they?
conflict all the time. Yeah, we double with that conflict all the time. From the moment that we wake up in the morning, we're constantly resolving conflict and negotiating either with ourselves or how we're going to take on the day, right? So that conflict is inevitable. The truth of the matter is that people don't realize, because it's so natural within us. It is something that we deal with it all the time. But what we don't realize is that we think that the way that we resolve conflict all the time is the best way to do it. And that is what we have learned from a very young age. And it stayed with us from a very young age. If you don't learn how to develop more skills as you grow up.
You were mentioning NLP before. How does that play into conflict resolution and conflict IQ?
NLP can be one of those tools that are very useful to help people to shift behavioral modification, to shift ways of thinking and ways of perceiving things from a different standpoint. It can also be useful to help people heal situations that they might have had with other people, and maybe that person is not available to be able to have that dialogue. And NLP can be very useful to take a person through that process, to help them develop that process of the healing, and then having an awakening at how that particular trauma has affected them throughout their life. And it's interesting that people don't realize that sometimes when they have conflict in one side of their life, they also have conflict on the other side of their life too, in their work.
So in NLP, there's a process called parts conflicts. Are you helping your clients integrate these parts internally? Is that part of the therapeutic process that you use?
Yes, that could be some of them. I have not taken a lot of people through those processes at NLP because I do it more consciously. I work with people and I ask a lot of questions, or I provide tools and awareness that perhaps people have not really think about, right? And that is how I help them to be able to resolve the conflict. There are a few people that says, "Hey, Vid, I read on your bio that you know NLP. Can you take me there?" And that takes, the person to be able to be more vulnerable in a state of more hypnotherapy, if you may, to be able to take them to a process of NLP. And the processes of NLP are not. Uh, and now sometimes you cannot do anything in an hour. You have to be able to be with the person for a more time in order to help them come through a breakthrough.
Mm. One of the magical parts about neuro-linguistic programming is also the ability to understand other people's language. And from what I've seen with
Yes.
conflict, people can be speaking about the same topic, but what we say in NLP is they're using a different representational system. For example, it can be as
Correct.
simple as somebody's visual language, and they're communicating with a real kinesthetic person. They're talking about the same
Mm-hmm.
topic, they're looking for the same outcome, but the biggest barrier
Mm-hmm.
is the language. And I think in
Yeah.
NLP,
You're, you're,
using those
you're
technologies,
totally right in there.
mm, well, I know with my wife,
Just by knowing that, you can resolve a lot of issues just by
mm,
knowing how to build rapport with other people, how to be able to translate the way that they communicate so that
mm,
they can make sense out of what you're saying. That helps to reduce conflict.
mm, mm. Yeah, I have a business partner and he will give me all this data. And I'll say, I don't care about the data. I need to see the big picture.
Mhm.
Give me an image, give me a diagram so I can see it. And we will go backwards and forwards, and my head will explode. Too much data. I need to see it. And as soon as he
Mhm.
shows me, something clicks in my mind and I finally get it.
Mhm.
And then once I see it, I can take in the data because I've got that visual in the mind. So I tell him, don't write me
Mhm.
these long emails, just give me the pictures and I'll ask for what I need. But I also have to provide him data if I want to make sure there's fewer conflicts, because he doesn't get the picture.
Exactly. Now you have to be translator into the numbers, into all of the data that person needs in order to make sense out of it, right?
Mhm. In any business and in any group, we go through 4 stages of team dynamics. We go through the forming stage, and this is when a group comes together for the first time. And it's like the honeymoon period of a relationship. The men don't pass gas, the ladies never use the bathroom, and everything's picture perfect like a Hollywood
Mhm.
movie. Once we get through the honeymoon phase, we go into the storming phase. And this is when we start to experience our first conflicts. We've kind of figured out each other's red lines and we're seeing how far we can push each other. And a lot of people start to have
Mhm.
conflicts at this stage and they get stuck in the storming phase. In Australia, we say the shit hits the fan. And now people are fighting, they're arguing, they're bickering, but they're not performing. And so they get stuck in this storming phase. The third phase of group
Mhm.
dynamics is norming. It's once we get through the conflict and the dust settles and everything's good. It's not great, but it's good. And about 80% of companies in my research get stuck in this norming phase. The profits are average, the sales are average, the performance is average, the output is average. But the goal of the company is to get to great. And that's the performing phase. And that's where they start to lower their cost of goods sold. Teams are operating effectively together. The customer acquisition process and the cost is lowering and it's speeding up. And that's where all businesses want to be. But they can't get there
Mhm.
until they get out of that storming phase. So from your perspective, when a group gets into this storming phase, how do they first recognize that they're actually in a conflict?
Well, first and foremost, conflict does not really happen at the moment people are fighting with each other or they're screaming at each other. It happened way before that, right? It could happen right at the beginning of the process when they're getting together and they're not, um, they're trying to be, like you said, they're trying to be very educated. They're trying to put the best face forward, but in reality, internally, something is happening. People, for whatever reason, they don't like each other, right? Maybe they remind them of somebody that they don't even know, but for whatever reason, they didn't like the tonality of a person, or they didn't like how the person looked, or what the person said, and then all of a sudden they keep it quiet and they don't talk about it, and and then it gets stacking, and then when the phase comes where people are already in the storm, that is when people are in a flight or flight or freeze mode, right? And then if people do not know how to understand conflict, how to understand themselves, and how to understand others, that is where they can stay in that cycle for a long time, right? But once you get to know yourself and your atypical style of resolving conflict, and you create awareness and consciousness about it, that opens you a big door of space in where you're willing and able to learn more, because you realize that the minimal skills that you had might not have been enough in order to overcome situations, and then you're open to have more opportunity of learning about different styles of conflict, about different ways of listening, uh, different ways of communicating, understanding people's personalities. There's layers and layers and layers of meta skills that people can learn in that space if they're willing to open the door in allowing themselves to not only learn about themselves, but then be able to bring more skills into the picture, right? In order to be able to have those better communications with one another. The problem is that what I find is that a lot of conflicts happened, and because conflict is energy and is very, how do you say, it goes in waves, people think that the situation has already been resolved, or that, you know they have figured it out, or it's already under the rug and it's not going to come back. And it doesn't happen that way. It just keeps there, and it keeps staggering. And then when the major problem happens, where people are screaming at each other, is when they're in the least space to be able to resolve issues. And that is perhaps when a third person that it's neutral can come in and help out and help
I
them
remember
to resolve the situation.
I remember two conflicts, and the first one seemed quite childish, but the second one was very serious. The first one, I remember a friend of mine had a girlfriend, and he would go out, they'd be on a date, they'd all be happy. But then he would come and speak to the boys, and he'd complain about his girlfriend. And he'd complain and complain and complain. And I said, what is the complaint? What's the challenge? And he said, I don't like the watch she wears. He said she dresses up nicely, but she wears this blue sports watch. And this, for him, was a crisis point. It was a point of tension for him that she wore a particular watch. And he would get so frustrated around us, but he'd never have a conversation with her. And for him, it created a lot of tension. We thought it was very pettish and childish, but for him, it was really important, because this watch was a conflict for him. And we would ask him, have you spoken to her about it? He's like, I wouldn't want to offend her. I said, well, it looks like you're pretty offended. Why don't you bring it up? He's like, oh, I couldn't do that. I wouldn't want to hurt her feelings. And I said, but you go out with her and you come back, and all we hear is this story about this bloody blue watch. What are you going to do about it? And what you were mentioning here was like an ebb and a flow. When he was with us, it was a problem. When he was with her, it was never a problem. And we were exhausted because we heard this constant conversation.
Yeah, but perhaps in that type of example you gave me, probably NLP would have come beautifully into the picture, because that person, for whatever reason, is not in their conscious level. For whatever reason, they associated the watch of something negative, right? And in using perhaps neuro-linguistic programming, you could have shifted the association that person had with the watch, that the watch meant all of those beautiful emotions that that person had whenever that they were with that person, and that would have solved the problem right away. What did you think?
For a lot of well, our group of friends, we thought this is not a problem, but for him, who was somebody who liked to dress well, present well, he took it so personal about this watch. And he even said, you've got to come and have a look at this watch. And he even took us down to where the girl worked. And he said, you got to look at the watch. And I said, I've seen the watch. I said, it's a sports watch. He's like, you don't get it. I said, I don't get it. That was the first one. The second one, I was working with
that person is very symmetrical. They're very symmetrical on the way that everything has to go hand in hand with what you're wearing and dressing up with. And maybe perhaps in his model of reality, the watch, that it was a sport watch, probably didn't go with all the clothes that that person was wearing, right?
No, I might send him a photo of a watch that looks like that. I might send him that today and see if he gets triggered 25 years later.
But that is a trigger. That is what we call a trigger. And either you help that person to have those difficult conversations with the other person, or find mechanisms of resolving the issue. Perhaps that person would have said, hey, let me take you to the store and buy you a very nice Rolex, for example, right? Or then helping that individual reduce the level of triggers when it came to the watch.
So true. Another one that I saw in business, there was a team. There was a team of about 20 people. And I was waiting in the business for the business owner to arrive. And so I was waiting in the lobby area. Anyway, I saw him hop out of his car, walk towards the business, and then he turned and went in another direction. And about 10 minutes later, he walked through the back door of the business. He invited me into his office to sit down. And I just asked him out of curiosity. I said, just out of curiosity, why didn't you walk through the front door? You saw I was there. Why did you go all the way around and come through the back door? And his skin's color started to change. You know, in NLP, we talk about sensory acuity. And I could see the skin go from light to dark. And it got darker and darker and darker. And then he kind of stopped breathing. And he said, I can't walk through the front door. And I said, is there a problem with the door? He said, no, there's no problem with the door. I said, what's the problem? He said, it's the person on the front desk. And I said, the person on the front desk? Really? He said, I said, what's the problem? He said, the person has a shit face. And I said, I've never heard that before. I said, what's a shit face? He said, I look at the face and I feel shit. And I said, so then what? He said, that's why I walk around the block and go through the back door so I don't have to see the person's face. I said, okay, interesting. Now, it wasn't the point of our coaching, but I heard this. A couple of months later, I come back to the office and the front of the office is under construction. A couple of months later, I come back for another appointment and the whole front office has changed. Anyway, I'm waiting in the front office and I see him cross the street and he walks through the front door. He invites me into his office and I said to him, I said, you came through the front door today. He said, I've just spent $100,000 redesigning the front of this business. And I said, why? He said, so I don't have to see the shit face every day. And I asked him out of curiosity, I said, have you addressed the problem? He said, no. He said, I wouldn't want to offend anybody. And I said, but you're walking around the back of your business. You've just spent $100,000 to change the front of the business so you don't have to see this person's face. Isn't there a better way? And he thought about it and he thought, what else could I do? And so we had a conversation and it was the trigger. The trigger for him was the face. It wasn't the person, but the person had a facial expression that took him back 30 years into his past and triggered off all those unresolved feelings from the past. And he spent $100,000 to redesign the office, but he was still getting triggered. But he didn't resolve the conflict internally or externally. And that one really stuck in my mind.
Yeah, but that is what I'm talking about, that sometimes people don't realize that there's many other ways to resolve conflict, right? And that is where that's where I talk about the levels of consciousness, as to how you can access those levels of consciousness, which is the levels of seeing things from a different lens, seeing things from a different perspective, to be able to resolve the issue. Perhaps that person didn't associate the face necessarily with somebody in the past, or maybe it did, but then the fact that there wasn't time perhaps, or a particular way or a person that can guide them to the process to resolve the issue, then people stayed for life with those type of triggers or with those type of issues. And it could be that person, then it could be somebody else. It could be somebody that is driving a car and all of a sudden look the same, right? And I think that when you have individuals that are not willing to look into different ways of seeing things, that is where we ended up with situations in where companies can dissolve just because of the fact that people don't get along, that partners do not get along. Right?
I've heard in the past, I'll
And
ask
if
somebody,
you work with those,
I've asked people, have you resolved the conflict? And they'll say, no, I'm just coping. Is coping and conflict resolution the same, or are they different things?
well, it's a style. It's a style of how they're dealing with the conflict because they don't know any better. And when people sometimes cope, which is called accommodation, these type of people, the people that avoid, the people that accommodate, can be a walking bomb, because it can come to a point in where they feel that they're accommodating so much that they feel that something is taken away from them eventually, because they're bending themselves in order to try to resolve the issue. And in their model of reality, they think they're a good person, they're very empathic, they're willing to go the extra mile to resolve the problem. But the problem is that if they do it constantly, then that is when it takes a toll either on their health, their mental well-being, or they become explosive to the other people. And that comes about because they don't know any better. They don't know how to resolve issues. They don't know how to communicate effectively. They don't know how, there's other styles of resolving conflict. And that happens very often. But in the model of reality, that person is like, I'm a good person. Why is this happening to me? I'm a good person. Yes, you might be a very good person, but very limited with communication skills.
People aren't born with the skills of conflict resolution. It's a skill set that has to be learned. And because it's a skill set, anybody of any personality style can learn this skill set. And I know this to be true because when I grew up, we had a small business as a family. And my mum didn't like to negotiate. And so she put a big sign up in the shop that said, no haggle, no hassle. Because she didn't want to negotiate. She didn't want to haggle. And I used to say to Mum, This is the type of shop where people want to come in and negotiate. They have a need for it in this particular product and service that we sell. So we shouldn't be telling our customers not to haggle, not to hassle. It's the environment. This is what they want in this environment. We have to learn to adapt. But it was always a tension point in the business. As I matured and went and learned other skills, I went and learned real estate and how to sell real estate. And one of the most important skills in selling real estate was the ability to negotiate. And the first thing I had to do was to negotiate an appointment. And I had to negotiate because there was other people also competing for the same business. And I had to get into the door. Once I got in the door, I then had to present and negotiate my own fee. And sometimes it felt like this person's attacking me. It's a personal attack. They want to reduce the fee. But it was all part of the process. And then once I would get the property on the market after a successful negotiation, I then had to be able to sell it. And now the negotiation process changed because now I'm representing the home seller and I'm negotiating with a buyer. But at the same time, when I'm looking at these buyers, I know it's going to be a one-time transaction, but I also hope for the business in the future when they sell it. So my negotiation had to be very fluid. It had to have a lot of thought into it because the home seller needs a win, the buyer needs the win, and I'm going to need more business and referrals in the years ahead. And when I first got into real estate, I had to really rewire. I needed that flexibility. As we say in NLP, the person with the most flexibility controls the situation. And I had to go from a no haggle, no hassle mindset to realizing that everything is negotiable. Everything. It doesn't matter if it's a contract. It doesn't matter if it's black and white. Everything is negotiable. And so I developed this new mindset. Everything's negotiable. And from there, I could start to deal with many different things. Conflict, maybe I didn't like so much. Negotiations, I did. But I believe that we can all
But it's
learn these
interesting what you're
skills.
talking about. You don't realize that there were many conflicts. And
Mm,
negotiation is the outcome or the process that you do in order to resolve those conflicts.
mm,
It's just a mindset.
mm,
In your idea is like I'm negotiating. In reality, what you're doing is the behaviors that can be used or the tools that can be used in order to resolve a conflict. You have a client that their conflict is, I want to sell the property. I want to sell it for the best possible price. I want to make sure that the real estate that I'm with is doing a good job, right? You come in, you negotiate with them, you work with them, you ease their anxieties, and you tell them, I'm gonna take care of you, and I'm gonna be the one that help you sell the house, right? So you go along the process, and then you negotiate with other people, right? But in the process, you're also resolving some levels of conflict. And I like how you realize that the negotiations can be very hard negotiations, and they can be negotiations that create win-win situations, right? And the ones that are very harsh, maybe you can reserve those when you're going to negotiate something and where you're never going to see the person again, versus the win-win ones, which is the interest base. You use those when you want to create win-win scenarios, because at the end of the day you're going to continue perhaps working with those individuals, or they're going to be the source of wanting to work with you because you were fair and you were willing to create a win-win scenario.
mm,
And that is exactly what I teach for specifically in this book, in women negotiation. It's a book for women. It's called In the High Heels of a Smart Negotiator. And that is exactly what I teach women. I always tell women, don't go by the marketing negotiation books, because you will see, Chris Boss, I think it's one of those Harvard educated, hostage negotiator, and he came out with a book and he marketed it so well that everybody has a copy in their hands or in their house. But I always explain to people, if you're going to negotiate a car or negotiate something and where you're not going to see people again, go ahead and use those hostile negotiations that Chris Voss is teaching you. But if you want to negotiate in the workplace, anything, it could be a project, it could be a conversation that you're having with your boss, a benefits or salaries or whatever you want to negotiate, you want to negotiate from an interest base so that you can create win-win situations, because that's going to create a what I call it is a social currency that will help you in the near future or in the future,
Mm.
and where you're going to continue to be in communication with those people, and those
Not
people are going
everything
to be
is
willing to
life and
work with
death.
you. Hmm.
It's like the Chris Voss method. In those situations, it's life and death. That's a different story. But
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
small business or in a community, you've got ongoing negotiations and you've got limited people, and you can't burn everybody. You've got to be able to keep it open. And I think that's what I took away from learning NLP, is that anything's possible in the presence of a good rapport. And as long as the rapport is maintained in the relationship, you can open a negotiation, you can pause a negotiation, you can close it, and you can reopen it at any time, as long as that relationship has been preserved. And if you're
Right.
working in an organization, you're not going to get everything that you want, and you're not going to get all the concessions that you want. And sometimes you've got to accept that. But if it's an ongoing negotiation with another department, you might get a little bit more flexibility next time. And so, yes, you've got to be able to keep it open. And as long as people are communicating, that's good. But once it becomes hostile and people stop talking, kind of like what I see in the Middle East at the moment, the bombs are being dropped during the middle of the negotiation. And they're saying, well, if you're going to bring a hammer, we're going to bring a sledgehammer. And it's not
Yeah,
effective.
and that is where I call it a very low level of consciousness, is them against you. And it's all about resources, the idea of a scarcity of resources, and maybe other things that we are not aware of as well, right? uh, but with those levels of consciousness where it's them against me or them against us, the perception about lack of resources, that's what creates these type of wars, and that's a very low level of consciousness.
Well, the low level chunk at the moment is they're killing us and we're killing them. But if you could chunk all the way up and look down, you'd realize that we're killing ourselves. And if they could negotiate from that higher level of consciousness that we're killing ourselves, things would change very quickly.
Yeah,
Because
because
if
you're
at a high
shifting
level
the
of consciousness we're all
consciousness,
one,
right?
we're killing ourselves, we're killing our own resources, we're depleting our own planet. If I drop a bomb on you, I'm dropping a bomb on myself. Once we realize that, things change very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where sometimes we don't have people that are willing to shift those levels of consciousness, because they're very fixed mindset. And in order to be able to bring these levels of win-win negotiation, you have to imbibe the growth mindset.
With a growth mindset, what changes in conflict resolution?
The possibilities, that you create more possibilities, and that you can even create something totally new that perhaps nobody have thought about it, but because they were sitting down, they were negotiating with the best intentions, and in order to support everybody's values and needs, then all of a sudden something new can be created. And that is what we see in innovation.
Values. That's a rare thing to talk about.
Mhm.
If I understood,
That is one of the reasons that conflict arises, because of values.
if I understood the other person's values and what was important to them, and they understood what was important to me, how does that transform the situation?
Bigger. It's huge, because now you're humanizing the conflict, and you're not seeing them against you. You're seeing a human being that has certain values, and that in order to work with that person, you also have to respect those values, or you also have to find ways and mechanisms that you understand those values, so that the person be open enough to understand your values, so that you can create that flexibility and that growth mindset in order to create something different.
Not everybody wants the same thing. And there's people out there who have talents like you do, who can get the other party to understand what's important to them and also to be able to understand what's important for you. And I feel that when we engage a third party to negotiate on our behalf, we can really dissociate. We can get our feelings outside of the negotiation. Feelings are important, emotions are important. But when somebody's acting on our behalf, it's like somebody's taking the bullets for us. And our stress
Mhm.
levels drop. And I say this to my mum, I say, Mum, if there's a conflict, just get the experts in. Get the experts in, let them do it on your behalf, let them take the bullets, enjoy your peace of mind. And she says, yes, that's what I'm going to do. I said, Mum, because your value above everything else is peace of mind. So you preserve that and let somebody else go in there so you don't have to go through the stress. Because these negotiations, these resolutions, when our emotions are involved, it is very taxing on the body. And just because we want to negotiate doesn't mean that we can. But if we can get an expert to do it, gee, it makes it better. I've exited businesses before. I've had problems with contracts. And I said to my lawyer, I said, look, you're the best man at the job. You do this. I'll go out. I'll make the sales. I'll pay your fee. I don't need the stress. And he always got a better result than I possibly ever could because he asked the right questions. He said the
Yeah,
right
but then
things.
if you think it about in a different way, by doing that and outsourcing that situation, you're paying money, but what else you also are losing opportunity to learn from that process, right? And maybe that is exactly what you want. You don't want to develop that. It is like, for example, in my situation, as much as I try to learn marketing to be able to promote myself, because a lot of people don't know that I exist, and a lot of bad consultants can get to the door of organizations and do very bad jobs, right? And they get paid. Um, it is because they have very good marketing skills, or they have the right person to do the marketing for them, right? And I can choose to do that and say, okay, I'm just gonna outsource that, and I don't want to know anything about marketing. I don't want to know anything about bookkeeping. I'm gonna outsource that. But then what it perhaps that will work for me, but at the same time, what am I losing? Well, perhaps I'm losing money. Perhaps I'm putting my bookkeeping in the hands of somebody that can perhaps do maneuvers that I don't know where the money's at, right? So there's always, a value loss and a value added. Yes, they can bring me in to resolve the conflict, but I bring different choices. Either you bring me and I can resolve it, or you bring me and I help you through that process in order for you to be able to experience what would happen so that you're not afraid of the whole process.
Mhm. I purchased a car about a year ago. And I said to my wife, I said, I'll go look at the car. I'll make the decision on what I'm going to have. But when it comes time to the negotiation, I want you to do the negotiation. One, because it's your native language and you understand the culture here in Taiwan.
Mhm.
So we went down and we looked at the cars. She did the negotiation. And then we thought to ourselves, who can negotiate a better deal? And it worked out that my mother-in-law was friends with one of the ladies who worked for the Nissan dealership. And so I rang my mother-in-law and I said, could you negotiate this deal? She got another $5,000 discount and another $5,000 worth of upgrades. And I said to my wife, see that? I'm going to go to work. I'm going to make the money. I'm going to pay the bills. You and your mum can do the negotiation. Because one, you know the language and you've also got the contact and you've got that relationship that's lasted a long time. And for me, that as a business owner, I could focus specifically on what I was good at. And
Yeah.
that is to do the selling, to do the consulting.
Mhm.
And I know with my negotiation skills over the years, my ability to negotiate has changed. I was doing an assessment the other day. I did yours yesterday. I was having a look at my
Mhm.
25 business skills, 25 soft skills. In these 25 soft skills that are universal, we look at relating, action, and thinking skills. And negotiation is there, and negotiation is a relating skill. And as I was going through my hierarchy, I realized that negotiation out of these 25 was around about number 15 on the list. So I know that my ability to negotiate isn't as sharp as it used to be. And
Mhm.
so I don't have to negotiate. Coming back to what you were saying about marketing, I've become a better marketer and a better seller. And I chose
Mhm.
to develop those skills so that I could market my product and service in a way that people say, that makes sense. I'm going to buy that.
Mhm.
And then I don't have to go through the negotiation process. I can say, this is my fee. This is what you get.
Yeah, because then they'll buy it, right? You don't have to negotiate. You just
No,
upgraded other skills in order to sell it by itself.
yes. And then what I do is that as I build my
Hmm.
business, I was saying to my team, I said, if we want to do more corporate work, then we need to get somebody who's a better negotiator to negotiate the fee, because I don't want to be part of that process. I want to come in as the talent, as the subject matter expert, but we need somebody who's more skilled and has more enjoyment in that process. And that's why I come back to saying, as I mentioned before, is that these skills are learnable. And people love to learn these skills. And the people who love to negotiate, love to resolve conflict, they should go out and learn more of these skills because they're valuable. In a market like this, if you can negotiate a better deal for the business and reduce cost of goods sold by $100,000 or $1 million, that's an important skill to have. In a market like this, if you can get $1 million more for your product and
Yeah,
service,
and
you've got a job for years.
yeah, and that is something that people don't realize, that the skills can be learned, but we tend
Mm,
to believe that the hard skills that we learn at school are the most important. But as the higher you go in your hierarchy of leadership, you realize that the most valuable skills are the people skills,
yep.
and be able to think differently, be able to understand people's philosophies of life. All those things in combination can help you to become a better leader, and it also helps you to become a better consultant, because then you're bringing those type of solutions to people that hadn't gotten to that level, in where they realize that what got them to the level that they are in their career might not get them to the next level, right? And the next level is learning the people skills, the psychology, the sociology, the anthropology, the philosophy, right? All of those combinations so that you can develop those skills that are going to advance you in so many different ways.
I was with a businessman yesterday, and he told me that he lost about $200,000 on a deal about 5 years ago. And he said he was very frustrated at the person that caused him to lose the money. But he also said, Daniel, I just did a $50,000 deal with that same person this week. And I asked him, I said, you went back and you negotiated a deal. You spent $50,000 after the other person caused you to lose $200,000. I said, what did you do? He said, I preserved the relationship. He said, yes, I was upset. Yes, it hurt financially, but I preserved the relationship because I thought to myself, there's going to be one day in the future that I'll still need that person. So he never burned them. And I said, well, what about the extra 200 grand? He said, I'll find a way to get it back. So in his mind, as a seasoned negotiator, he's saying, okay, this person is important. They've got something of value and I've lost 200,000. I've got to separate these things inside of my mind. There's an opportunity to do business. We've done a deal. And there's still an opportunity where I could get the $200,000 back. I just haven't figured it out yet. But it's this ongoing negotiation. The door's still open for 5 or 7 years. And I look at him and I think to myself, he's learned to negotiate. He's learned the skills, but he also realizes that there's so much more to learn. And I think as we negotiate, we've got to keep learning about it. We've got to learn about people. We've got to learn about behaviors. Exactly. We've got to learn about ourselves. We've got to learn about markets. We've got to learn about environments. Because in my lifetime, I've discovered that there's 4 conflicts. The first conflict that we all have is a me conflict. And I learned that through studying NLP. A lot of people are highly conflicted. We feel on the inside that I've been taken advantage of, but I'm also conflicted because I feel like a people pleaser and I don't want to upset people by asking for what I want. We have a lot of these me conflicts. We also have me-you conflicts. And it could be that I'm very aggressive and you're passive, and that creates a conflict. It's just a behavior. But there's always conflicts with other people. The third one I learned by having a series of jobs, which is called a me-role conflict. Some people feel conflicted because they take a job for the money and then they realize that they've got to negotiate. And they go, oh my gosh, I never realized I had to negotiate. This role creates a conflict. But that can be solved by learning a new skill because all skills are learnable. And then fourthly is the me-environment conflict. And the environment conflict I learned when we had our family business. And that's when I said to my mum, you can't have the sign, no haggle, no hassle. This is the environment. This is the world we live in. And we have to adapt to it. And they were the 4 conflicts. Me, you, me role, me environment. And all of us are going to have to face those throughout our life. Sometimes all 4 of them at once. But we've got to get through the conflict.
Well, I have an entire list of how conflicts can come about. You know, I have a list. Whenever I'm teaching this, I explain that sometimes this can be generational, can be personal, you know, personality styles, the style of resolving conflict, values, beliefs, culture. You know, it's a whole list, you know, that I have developed throughout, you know, the 15 years of me teaching this. Because not only do I teach this, you know, in corporate, I also am an instructor. And I've been teaching this for almost 15 years.
What's an example of a generational conflict?
Well, you know, in a generational conflict is, first and foremost, you have to understand that, you know, even though that people have their own personality styles and their own culture and we're embedded, within cultures. Um, Individuals are exposed with very different scenarios, situations. Um, it could be governmental situations happening in their time life. It could be, environments of educational aspects of, engineering and technology and all of that stuff. It could be embedded ideology in the governments that you have been raised upon, right? Based on the different, years of life that you have lived. So all of that, it's going to create a certain level of frictions and resiliencies and ways of seeing life. And when you have a younger generation working with a very traditional generational style, there's going to be conflicting situations because the traditional one is going to think, so you think that you're just coming here at the age that you're coming, very young, and thinking that you're going to be able to ascend in hierarchies very quickly? It took me 20 years. Who are you to think that you can do that, right? That could be a problem. And you have the younger generation that, because they have been exposed more to technology, to more information than this traditional person has, they come with different resiliency, with different technologies, with different
Mm.
knowledge, right? And they feel that they can navigate the world of leadership and be able to get into the higher levels, right? So that could create a friction and a conflict, you know, somebody not being very patient with the traditional ones, or the traditional ones feeling that the younger generation are very fast to make decisions and stuff like that, right? So those could be generational problems that can happen.
We definitely see that here in Taiwan. Is
Mhm.
people who have been educated in the West, they believe that they're going to get a promotion because of performance. But the ones who have been born and bred and educated here, they sometimes realize that you've just got to wait for somebody to die before you
Mhm.
get a promotion. And
Mhm.
the people who've been educated in the West and come here, they get frustrated because it's not happening at the pace that I've been taught. But the people say this is totally normal. What you do is you just wait your turn 20, 30, 40 years, sometimes longer. And when that person
Mhm.
dies, then everybody shifts position. And there's no good or bad, right or wrong in that because it works, but it's generational. It's something that has happened
Mhm.
for 3 or 4 generations. So it's just totally normal here. But for an outsider, it's like,
Right.
gee, that's frustrating. But I get it.
Yeah.
It's generational. But for people who want to learn about the conflict IQ framework, where should they go and where can they do their first assessment? I did my assessment yesterday, thoroughly enjoyed it, got a good ranking, got some areas of improvement to go. Where should they begin their journey with you?
Well, they can look me up under my name, and I will come out in different podcasts. And they can look me up on LinkedIn under Yvette Durazo, or the website is called unitivconsulting.com, or they can just type conflict dash IQ, and my website will come out.
Wonderful. Yvette, thank you for your time and thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I didn't know that you were in Taiwan, but that's so interesting that we can do these things, with technology. It's fascinating.
We're global. Thank you.
Thank you.